video, we'll cover a new feature being added in HCL Launch version 7.1 called deployment triggers. Deployment triggers replace previous functionality that existed on the component configuration called run process after version import. Deployment triggers will run a specified application process on an environment whenever a version is imported for a specific component. However, the run process after version import field had several limitations that we've solved with deployment triggers. The first being that it only worked on versions imported from the HCL Launch user interface using a source configuration plugin. So it did not work if you were pushing artifacts into the server via our CLI. The second being that it would run the application process as the admin user, and there was no way to change that user if you wanted to restrict the amount of permissions used in that deployment. And the third being that only one application process could be specified per component. So with deployment triggers, you can specify any amount of triggers, which will let you run any number of application processes whenever a version is imported. So a deployment trigger, unlike the old run process after version is imported functionality, is configured on a specific environment. So I have a JKE banking application, and on that application I have a development environment which has deployment triggers configured. But before I look into that, we'll look at my application. This is just a simple application. It has 3 components on it: a controller, a database, and a front-end component. And it has a very simple deployment process called install components, which will just run each component's specific installation process in a specific order. So on my development environment, I have configured deployment triggers under the configuration tab and a new deployment trigger subheading. So for each of my components, I've specified it so it runs the install components process using the admin user whenever a new version is imported. And if we create a deployment trigger, we'll see that we can specify these things. So the components field has access to all components that are in the application. The application process, likewise, is all application processes on the application. And the executing user field is all users that have a new run deployment trigger permission, which is a system-wide permission. So in this case, only my admin user has it, but if I were to configure another user that had run deployment triggers, that user would show up in this list. So let's see this in action. Let's go to our JKE front end. We'll import a new version, version 2.0. And we should see that once that version is imported, we have now kicked off a install components process on the dev environment. So if we drill into that, we should see that only the front end portion of this process actually did anything. All the others will say no version selected. But since we did provide a version for our JKE banking front-end component, we proceeded with our deploy process, which means that the development environment now has the latest and greatest JKE banking front-end portion installed, leaving the others untouched. And that pretty much sums it up. I hope you find them to be great tools to ensure that your lower level environments have the latest build artifacts pushed to them as soon as they're encountered by the UCD server. Thanks for watching.